Somewhere across social media right now, tens of millions of gardeners are watching short videos that show the same striking image: a wooden dowel wrapped in a spiral of copper wire, pushed into the soil of a raised bed, with a caption promising that this simple setup will double or even triple every crop in the garden by pulling atmospheric energy out of the sky and channeling it into the soil below. The videos are everywhere. The hashtag has accumulated hundreds of millions of views. Gardening supply companies are selling copper wire kits, pre-wound antenna coils, and complete electroculture starter sets on every online marketplace. Comment sections fill with testimonials from home gardeners who claim their tomatoes doubled, their peppers exploded, their zucchini set fruit like never before, all because of a $2 length of copper wire wrapped around a bamboo stake. And every gardener watching those videos is asking the same question: is this real, or is it the most successful piece of gardening pseudoscience in modern history? The honest answer is more interesting than either the enthusiasts or the debunkers have been willing to say out loud. Because the practice everyone calls electroculture has a genuine history, stretching back over 200 years. Real French scientists patented real devices in the 1920s and reported real yield increases across thousands of European farms. The United States Department of Agriculture actually studied the phenomenon in the early 20th century, and modern peer-reviewed research has documented that certain forms of controlled electrical stimulation produce measurable effects on plant biology under laboratory conditions. The question is not whether electroculture is real. The question is whether the specific version being sold to millions of gardeners on social media in 2026 bears any meaningful resemblance to the research that actually produced results, or whether an entire industry has grown up around a distortion of historical science that never actually worked the way modern videos describe. But before I show you what the real research actually documents, and what the modern trend gets meaningfully wrong about the science it claims to be based on, you need to understand something almost every video on this topic gets completely backward. The debunkers say electroculture is a scam invented on TikTok. That is false. The trend is not new, and the underlying question of whether electrical energy influences plant growth is a legitimate scientific inquiry with published peer-reviewed research going back generations. The enthusiasts say a copper spiral in your garden will double your yields based on suppressed ancient wisdom. That is also false. The specific setup being promoted on social media is not what the historical researchers actually built, and the claimed results are not what any peer-reviewed study has ever documented at that scale. Stay with me, because the truth sits in a much more interesting place, and by the end of this video, you will know exactly what the 2 centuries of actual research support, what the modern trend distorts, and what you can and cannot expect if you try this in your own garden. The story does not start on TikTok. It starts in Paris, France, in the year 1783, when a Catholic priest and natural philosopher named Abbé Bertholon published a book titled De l'électricité des végétaux, meaning the electricity of plants. Bertholon was one of the earliest scientists to systematically investigate whether atmospheric electricity influenced plant growth. He conducted experiments in which plants were grown next to electrified metal wires connected to lightning rods, comparing their growth against control plants without the electrical connection. His results, published in an era before modern experimental controls or statistical analysis, suggested that electrified plants grew more vigorously than their unstimulated counterparts. Bertholon's work marked the beginning of a scientific inquiry that would continue in fits and starts for the next 240 years. Through the 19th century, various European researchers replicated and expanded his experiments. In the 1840s, a Scottish researcher named Alexander Bain reported yield improvements in crops grown under wire arrays carrying weak electrical currents. In the 1880s, a Finnish physicist named Karl Selim Lemström conducted extensive field trials using overhead networks of charged wires suspended above cultivated fields. Lemström reported significant yield increases in cereal crops across multiple growing seasons, and his work was documented in scientific journals of the era. By the turn of the 20th century, electroculture was a recognized field of agricultural research, with active investigations underway in France, Germany, Britain, and the United States. The most influential figure in this history, and the one whose work directly inspired the modern social media trend, was a French inventor named Justin-Christophe Loew, born in 1868. Christophe Loew spent years developing what he called an atmospheric energy collection device, a system of metal rods, wires, and grounded conductors designed to capture what he described as the natural electrical currents of the Earth and atmosphere and channel them into cultivated soil. He patented his apparatus in France and eventually across multiple countries. In 1921, he published the first edition of his book on the technique, expanded and republished throughout the 1920s. Christophe Loew claimed that his device could increase crop yields by 50 to 200%, prevent plant diseases, deter insect pests, and accelerate germination. Between 1922 and 1927, French farmers in the wine-growing regions west of Paris installed the devices on their farms and vineyards and reported doubled harvests, larger fruit, and improved flavor. Christophe Loew claimed that over 1 million of his devices had been installed across France, England, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, and Sweden by the late 1920s. His work was written up in agricultural publications across Europe, and for a brief period in the interwar years, electroculture appeared poised to become a major branch of practical agriculture. Here is the part nobody talks about. Christophe Loew's device was not the copper spiral around a wooden stake that appears on modern social media. His apparatus was a substantial engineered structure, several feet tall, incorporating multiple metals in specific configurations, grounded through galvanized wire, buried in straight lines pointing to magnetic north, positioned on tall posts above the field, and designed with specific attention to voltaic effects between zinc and copper components. The device functioned as a passive collector of atmospheric potential, similar in principle to a lightning rod, generating extremely small continuous electrical currents that Christophe Loew believed benefited the soil. Whether those effects were real or whether the reported yield increases came from the enthusiasm and improved practices of the farmers who installed the devices remains an open question. What is clear is that Christophe Loew's actual invention was significantly more complex than the modern copper spiral, and the historical research he inspired involved substantially more sophisticated setups than anything sold in an electroculture starter kit on the internet today. The scale of the historical enterprise is worth understanding because it explains why the modern trend feels so plausible to gardeners encountering it for the first time. Christophe Loew operated a factory outside Paris that manufactured his devices at commercial scale. He employed dozens of workers. He published detailed installation manuals with technical drawings. He testified before French agricultural committees. His work was reviewed in scientific journals of the era across multiple European languages. Farmers who installed his devices formed regional associations to share results and troubleshoot problems. The apparatus was not sold as a novelty. It was marketed as serious agricultural equipment to farmers who staked their livelihoods on its performance. For a period of roughly 15 years between the mid-1920s and the beginning of the Second World War, electroculture was a legitimate branch of European agricultural practice, taken seriously by farmers, discussed in trade publications, and studied by government researchers. When the war interrupted European agriculture and the post-war synthetic fertilizer revolution transformed farming economics, Christophe Loew's system did not fail because it was exposed as fraud. It faded because it could not compete with the dramatic yield increases that industrial nitrogen fertilizer delivered at scale. The historical legitimacy of the practice is what gives the modern trend its emotional pull and what makes the honest scientific evaluation so uncomfortable for both enthusiasts and skeptics. Now stay with me, because the science behind what happened next is critical to understanding where the modern trend went wrong. Through the 1930s and 40s, agricultural research stations across the United States and Europe attempted to replicate Christofleau's reported results under controlled experimental conditions. The results were disappointing. The United States Department of Agriculture conducted studies on electrical stimulation of crops in the early 20th century and ultimately concluded that the effects were inconsistent, difficult to reproduce, and not commercially viable at the scale required for American farming. Similar conclusions were reached at agricultural experiment stations in Britain, Germany, and Canada. By the end of the Second World War, electroculture had largely disappeared from mainstream agricultural research, not because of an industry conspiracy, but because the reported effects failed to hold up under rigorous experimental testing. The synthetic fertilizer revolution of the post-war era offered farmers dramatic, reproducible yield increases that electroculture could not match, and the historical interest in atmospheric electricity as an agricultural stimulant faded into obscurity for the next several decades. Here is the shareable detail that should change how you think about this trend forever. A comprehensive academic review published in 2024, titled From Electroculture to Plasma Agriculture, examined the full historical arc of research into electrical stimulation of plants across 3 centuries. The review documented what modern peer-reviewed research actually supports. Controlled laboratory experiments using precisely calibrated electrical fields applied directly to plant tissue at specific voltages and durations have demonstrated modest measurable effects on seed germination rates, root development, and some growth parameters. Certain forms of high-voltage plasma treatment have shown promising results in seed priming and disease suppression under laboratory conditions. These findings are real, replicable, and published in peer-reviewed journals. What the same review documented equally clearly is that the passive copper antenna approach popularized on social media does not correspond to any of the setups used in successful modern research. The review explicitly described Christofleau's atmospheric antennas as functioning more like lightning rods than genuine energy transfer systems, and characterized the underlying premise as scientifically unfounded despite its historical popularity. The gap between what real electroculture research supports and what modern social media promotes is not small. It is substantial and consequential. So why is the modern version of this technique spreading so successfully across social media despite the lack of peer-reviewed support? The answer is a combination of several factors that have almost nothing to do with the underlying science. The imagery is striking. A copper spiral pushed into garden soil is visually distinctive, photographs beautifully, and translates into short-form video content that performs well on algorithm-driven platforms. The philosophy is appealing. The idea that ancient wisdom has been buried by modern chemistry taps into a legitimate frustration with the industrial agriculture system. The barrier to entry is low. Copper wire costs under $15, and anyone with basic tools can construct a copper spiral antenna in less than an hour. And the results are impossible to disprove in casual home gardens because uncontrolled backyard experiments never isolate the actual variable being tested. A gardener who installs a copper antenna also typically pays closer attention to their plants, waters more consistently, and observes results more carefully than they otherwise would. Any improvement in yield is attributed to the antenna, when the actual cause was the improved gardener attention. Now, I need to be honest with you, because dishonesty about this topic damages the credibility of legitimate gardening advice. The modern electroculture trend is not a scam invented by con artists. Its historical roots are real. Its scientific inquiry is legitimate. Its underlying question about electrical influence on plant biology remains an active area of published research. But the specific implementation being promoted on social media in 2026 does not correspond to what has actually been shown to produce measurable effects under scientific conditions. If you install a copper spiral in your garden bed, you may notice improvements in your plants. Those improvements are far more likely to reflect the placebo effect of paying closer attention to your garden than any electrical effect from the copper wire itself. The claims of doubled or tripled yields circulating on social media are not supported by any peer-reviewed research, and they meaningfully overstate what even the most optimistic historical reports actually claimed. There is a second honest reality worth flagging, and this one matters for the health of your soil. Copper is a micronutrient that plants need in trace quantities, but copper in excess is toxic to plant tissue, to beneficial soil bacteria, and to the fungal networks that healthy garden soil depends on. Pushing copper wire deep into your soil for years at a time can gradually accumulate copper concentrations in the root zone that damage the biological community you have spent seasons building. This risk is not theoretical. Agricultural researchers have documented copper toxicity effects in soils where copper accumulation exceeds natural background levels. If you experiment with copper antennas, use uncoated copper wire in reasonable quantities, do not oversaturate your beds with metal, and rotate or remove the wire between growing seasons rather than leaving it permanently in place. Here is what the actual science supports for improving your garden yields based on peer-reviewed research rather than social media enthusiasm. Rebuild your soil biology through consistent applications of compost, mulch, and organic amendments. Feed the microbial community with materials like blackstrap molasses, activated charcoal, and fermented plant preparations that have documented effects on soil health. Restore trace minerals like magnesium, boron, and potassium that have been depleted from decades of intensive cultivation. Choose heirloom varieties bred for flavor and nutrition rather than shipping durability. Save your own seeds from the most productive plants each season. Practice companion planting and crop rotation. These techniques have peer-reviewed support, produce measurable improvements, and cost less than a copper wire starter kit. The path to a productive garden runs through soil biology, not through metal antennas capturing atmospheric energy from the sky. If you still want to experiment with electroculture in your own garden, do it properly. Set up a genuine controlled experiment. Plant identical varieties in identical soil under identical conditions. Install a copper antenna on one bed and leave the other as your control. Measure germination dates, plant height at defined intervals, and total harvest weight across a full growing season. Compare the results honestly. If you find a real effect that survives rigorous comparison, you will have contributed something genuinely valuable to a question that has been debated for 240 years. If you find no meaningful difference, you will have joined the substantial majority of controlled experiments that have failed to reproduce the dramatic claims circulating on social media. Either outcome is more valuable than another anecdotal testimonial that cannot distinguish between the effect of a copper wire and the effect of paying closer attention to your plants. Here is one more shareable detail worth understanding before you decide what to do with all of this. The 2-century arc of electroculture research is not really a story about copper wire. It is a story about how enthusiasm and evidence relate to each other in science and in gardening. Every single decade since 1783 has produced gardeners and researchers who genuinely believed they had discovered something remarkable. Some of them ran their own farms and vineyards for years or decades on the assumption that atmospheric electricity was transforming their yields. Their observations were sincere. Their crops were real. Their conviction was earned through direct experience of their own gardens. And yet, when the same practices were tested under rigorous experimental conditions with proper controls, the dramatic effects consistently failed to appear. This gap between sincere observation and controlled measurement is one of the oldest problems in agricultural science, and it explains why so many gardening techniques have come, gone, come back again, and gone again across the last 3 centuries. What feels like a discovery in one garden often turns out to be the effect of the gardener's own attention, effort, and expectation on plants that would have responded to any careful intervention. This is not a criticism of anyone experimenting with copper spirals in 2026. It is a caution that the human capacity to find patterns in our own gardens far exceeds our capacity to prove those patterns exist independently of our observation. The next time you scroll past another video promising that a copper spiral will double your tomatoes, remember what you now know. The history is real. The historical research is real. The underlying scientific question is real. But the modern version being sold to millions of gardeners has drifted a substantial distance from what the actual research documents, and the extraordinary claims circulating online are not supported by the extraordinary evidence that any real scientific breakthrough requires. Your garden deserves better than a 200-year-old distortion dressed up in social media packaging. The techniques that actually double yields are less photogenic, take longer to implement, and require patient work with soil biology. But they work every single time, in every climate, on every kind of soil, without any wire in the sky or spiral in the ground. The harvest begins now.